I think of Tony Kushner as one of the few living playwrights who needs no introduction, which is kind of marvelous. He may hate this if I say it, but it's probably still because of Angels in America. It was one of those wonderful moments of the right place and the right time and the right writer. It went to Broadway, it won Tony Awards, it won the Pulitzer, in a moment in which American culture needed a piece of art to bring a lot of different strains together. Gay rights, the AIDS era, Reaganism, the Cold War, this was the work that did it, and it was partly through its sheer astonishing ambition. Probably since Arthur Miller, there hasn't been a playwright where a single play thrust them into the forefront quite so spectacularly, who then took on that responsibility to try to write work after work after work that continued and deepened that interrogation of what it means to be American. Tony's work has constantly pushed all other theater makers to be thinking bigger, to be engaging more, to not rest on our laurels, and to have our theater making mean something. Thanks.
Hi, Mike. Good to see you.
I forget, you have a lot of books.
There are a lot of books. So we're gonna go in
I'll
after
go
you,
before
don't we?
you.
You're probably in here somewhere.
Oh, that'd be nice. At some point, I'm gonna ask you about Shaw,
okay.
who always confuses me.
He's very confusing and really great.
What
So
else we got up here?
Tennessee Williams, yeah, everybody.
Yeah. I haven't read The Lar.
Oh, it's great.
Yeah.
It's like one of the best things ever written about dramaturgy. It's fantastic and
exciting.
really upsetting and disturbing. We'll sit, we'll talk.
Awesome. So I was talking to my father about talking to you, and he was mentioning that when he first saw Caroline or Change, it had occurred to him for the first time that you could be considered a Southern writer. I'm interested in if in any way you consider yourself in the sort of grand tradition of Southern writers, and certainly when we think of Southern playwrights, we think of Tennessee Williams,
Yeah.
and sort of what connection you feel in that way, or none.
Yeah, I know. In some ways, I do consider myself a Southern writer. I of the sort of the big three playwrights, Tennessee was the easiest for me to have access to. I'm sure in part because he was gay, but also because of the Southern cadences, which are what I grew up with.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a certain kind of lyricism and languid rhythms in Southern speech that I absorbed. Permission to kind of be a little purple when you create prose. And you know, I grew up in Bayou Country, Louisiana, which is very, very humid and semi-tropical and wet and sort of bursting at the seams with life of various kinds. I grew up in the middle of a woods with a swamp in the backyard and alligators and water moccasins, and we had a pet raccoon. So I'm grateful that I didn't have an urban childhood. I feel like I got in touch with some kind of something sort of sublime and not entirely artificial as a kid. I started high school around 1972 when there was still federal busing. So the high school that I went to, which had been previously all white, was integrated, 50% black and 50% white. And unlike my northern cousins, I had friends who were African American, and I got to see the federal government really sort of aggressively pursue a program of social engineering, and it worked. I mean, the school was integrated. It got immediately better and more interesting. I was on the debate team. The debate team got better and more interesting. And no one died and no one killed anybody else. And for 3 or 4 years, until the white people passed a bond issue and moved all their kids to some remote suburb of Lake Charles, which is the town I grew up in, you really felt like, oh, if everyone cooperated in this project, we could make everything in this country a lot better fairly rapidly. And it's, you know, a constant source of heartbreak for me that we retreated from that during the course of the 70s and 80s. But I got to participate in it, and that was thrilling. And, you know, I've also said this a lot, as a gay man, when I needed a model a few years later, once I'd come to New York and I was in the process of coming out, which was a very different thing then than it is now, I had available a really terrific model of what it meant to be a member of a small minority, insisting on its rights in the face of aggression and hostility from a majority that was in many ways not welcoming, because I had been a Jew in a small southern city. But my parents understood Hannah Arendt's thing. If you're a pariah, claim your status as a pariah, don't become a parvenu. And so that was a perfect model for...
Then what was the impetus years later to finally go back and look at that world specifically in Caroline? That seems like it might have been one of the first things you would have done, but it feels like it took you a long time to really want to go back and re-examine the world of Louisiana and your childhood.
Yeah.
And had you wanted to go back and explore where you grew up before that?
I still want to explore it. I'm fascinated by Louisiana. I'm, sort of fascinated and horrified by the American South in general. I mean, what's happened to it economically and in many ways culturally and politically, it's a very vivid and terrifying illustration of what happens to a society when it completely fails to learn the lessons of its own history. So I'm interested in that sort of stuff. When I was a freshman at Columbia and I first started to think about being a playwright, I wrote in my journal, if I can think of 12 ideas for plays in an hour, then I'll be a playwright. And one of the first ones that I wrote down was there's a black woman working for a Southern Jewish family, and in some way she's president of the United States. And then I wrote all 12 in an hour, and so I felt like, okay, maybe I can be a playwright. But I always sort of mulled over the woman that Caroline Thibodeau is based on, Maudie Lee Davis, who's very much alive. And we had a deep and complicated relationship that grew and changed as I got older. And I found that relationship something that I very much wanted to go and explore. But I'd always been terrified of the idea of writing anything autobiographical, because, it seems like if you begin writing an autobiography, you get trapped in it. And I've always thought, stay as far away from that as possible. Maybe like O'Neill, at the very end of your life, you start doing the autobiographical stuff. I think that it was the fact that this thing would be sung, that there would be a composer working on it, that it would be about music, made it possible for me to go back there. I didn't realize it until I worked on Caroline. All of my memories have, Mozart and Brahms and Ravel and people like that sort of running through them, because I listened to them night and day. I grew up in a house of musicians. My father and mother were both, Juilliard and Eastman trained musicians who had pretty impressive careers in New York and made music for the entirety of their lives in Louisiana. My father was an orchestra conductor for 40 years. And my mother wanted me to be a cellist. She was a bassoonist, and somebody was always practicing.
What was the music that meant the most to you when you were young?
Oh, gosh. Well, I was always interested in opera and operetta. My grandparents had a big Gilbert and Sullivan collection, so I memorized the Mikado. In terms of serious music, I shouldn't say that. All music is serious. But what my father would accept as serious music. There were just sort of chance encounters. Like my father bought me Bernstein's Mass, a recording of the Mass when it was first being done at the Kennedy Center. And I listened to that with him, and I loved that. He got a big, I think it was Schulte's recording of the Ring. and when it arrived, it was a big deal. It was the whole Ring. And he and I listened to the entire thing together over the course of about 3 or 4 weekends, and he played the leitmotifs on the piano, and I thought that was the coolest thing. And also, we had a complicated relationship, so the fact that we could share something like that was exciting. And
talking about Caroline, I'm interested in how often you've put real people in, not even characters based on real people, but if you think of Lincoln or Roy Cohn or pretty spectacularly Laura Bush.
People have done this before. There are certainly works of fiction, and of course, all of the kings in Shakespeare. I mean, and what we understand of the English monarchy, at a certain point, you just hand it all over to Shakespeare. So the use of the transformation of history through literature is fascinating to me. But I feel like I have to say this because he just died, and we were all thinking about him this summer. E.L. Doctorow's Ragtime. I think I was in high school when Ragtime was published, and I don't know why it loomed so large when he did it, but I think there was a sense that of permission that it gave a lot of people, certainly me, to sort of dig into history, not just as a sort of background for creating fiction, but to actually force fiction and historical fact, such as we know it to be, into collision with one another. Once I started working in film, my feelings about it changed a little bit, because when you write a film for Steven Spielberg and it gets sort of pulled into the whole sort of awards race, this kind of ugly game of gotcha enters, where people like Maureen Dowd at the New York Times rear back in sham horror to discover that what they're watching is actually a work of fiction and not a work of history. And everybody sort of turns into, Bottom the Weaver or Peter Quince, and they're like, wait a minute, isn't this real? And so there's an anxiety that one has. I mean, I in both Munich and Lincoln, the two films that I made with Spielberg, was very, very anxious to make sure that we didn't change any significant outcomes of anything, nor falsify the way that those outcomes were arrived at. Those seem to me to be the two great crimes of making historical fiction. If it didn't happen that way, or if it didn't happen, then it's fiction, it's not history. But if it happened exactly that way, then it's not fiction, it's just history. And of course, the minute you write a character, and if I write Abraham Lincoln and Mary Lincoln having a fight in their bedroom, no one was listening to that fight. And so I get to make it up. And when Daniel Day-Lewis and Sally Field are playing those people, there's another level of interpretation, and Stephen is filming them. And it's, so of course, you have to, on some level, believe that the audience can come in and know that it's watching a work of fiction, but know that if we want to find out, as much as we can possibly learn about what happened, I'm going to have to go and do homework.
What's interesting to me, I hadn't thought of it this way. I think we were on, you invited me to be part of when Gene Kennedy Smith was creating the Kennedy Prize, which is for plays or works of drama about history. And I remember at some point, Angels in America was brought up as an example of would this count as a history play? And weirdly, I think I was on the group of people who first said, well, no, because it was, when I first saw it, it felt so much about the present. And then looking at your plays, I was amazed how many are history plays. And then the two that I could come up with that really felt like when they were presented, they took place in the present now, were Intelligent Homosexuals Guide, which I think was as close to taking place in when you were writing it first. And in a sense, Homebody, which the events overtook you in some ways. So by the time it was presented, the events of history had happened. But those two felt like the ones where you were writing in a now, if that makes sense.
My relationship to, Angels is set in the mid-'80s, and I started writing it in 1988. And I wrote the first draft of Intelligent Homosexuals Guide in 2009, and it's written about 2007. So those, I feel, are sort of contemporary plays. Homebody, I started writing a play about Afghanistan in 1997, and the first question I was asked by every journalist that I did an interview with was, why are you writing a play about Afghanistan? Where is that, and why does anybody care about it? And I thought, this is, it is a weird thing to be writing about. And then, of course, something happened. When I started working on Intelligent Homosexuals Guide, I thought about writing it about 2009. Then I decided, no, I really want to do it about when Bush is still president, before Obama, because I think everything changed in profound ways when Barack Obama became elected president in this country. But I also felt more secure if I'm looking back a couple of years, then at least I have that much distance. The world at any moment presents itself to me the way I think it presents itself to pretty much everybody, which is, what the fuck is going on? And this is too much. And what am I eating for dinner tonight? And, why did so-and-so, see me on the subway and not say hello? And, oh, look at that cute guy over there. It's like a little bit. And I have enormous respect, among other things. We had been talking earlier about The Normal Heart. Normal Heart is written about the moment that it's in. and it manages somehow to have clarity and insight into that moment and what's really going on. And when you consider how genuinely nightmarish that moment was, I mean, it just felt like the world was coming apart. And Larry's willingness to simply hold a steady gaze at himself and at the people around him and how they were responding gave us this theatrically devastating dissection of an oppressed people encountering, a biological catastrophe and beginning to fight their way through it. There are very few things that are like that, and it's not something that I feel that I have the aptitude for.
Well, just shifting slightly, you talked about making the list of if I can
plays.
become a playwright if, and I'm interested partly in what in your freshman year at Columbia made you think I want to be a playwright, but also it feels like you took a few, not wrong turns, but you're a medievalist?
I was a medieval studies major up until my senior year at Columbia when the medieval studies department said I couldn't take Edward Taylor's 2-semester course in Shakespeare because Shakespeare is Renaissance, not medieval. It was also in my junior year, Richard Foreman did Threepenny Opera at Vivian Beaumont during the years that Joe Papp ran Lincoln Center. And I had just read Mother Courage for the first time. I had started reading Marx. I didn't really understand Marx, and I didn't really understand Mother Courage. And then I saw that production, and then I saw it 8 more times because I'd never seen anything like it. And I mean, it's indescribable what it felt like. And I started reading Shakespeare with Taylor, and his approach to Shakespeare was entirely about dialectics.
So what did you graduate with a degree in?
English,
Okay.
Some English literature. I mean, it was that thing that happens. It's why I think everybody should get a liberal arts degree and not do, theater majors, because you have the opportunity to read words that absolutely cause an earthquake in your interior landscape and change your sense of everything. And Brecht and Marx and Shakespeare and Richard Foreman and the avant-garde. I mean, I started going down to see the Wooster Group and to see what Spalding Gray and Liz Lecomte were doing and creating these astounding pieces, like some of the most thrilling pieces of theater I've ever seen in my entire life. And, it felt like a new continent, a new world was opening up of aesthetic possibility and also of understanding what life was about. And in part through Brecht, permission to be a playwright if you felt that you also wanted to spend your life as an engaged human being who had some intention to exercise agency in the fate of the planet, the fate of your community, that you wanted to not stand off on the side and make entertainment that had nothing to do with the struggles of your day. It was there was a lot of revelation and eye-opening.
And that moment you became a director.
I stupidly thought directing would be easier. It isn't. But it seemed at the time to me. And so I decided I wanted to go to NYU and study directing. And I'm glad I did, because I think it's really important for playwrights to know what goes on in a rehearsal room. It's really, the WRIGHT part of it, the part of it that is a craft, that's something kind of less sort of airy-fairy and more, sort of nuts and bolts, the really stupid thing. Is there an action? Is there a conflict? Is there an action? What is this character doing on stage? What did they come to get? Did they get it? Then why are they still on stage talking? Did they not get it? What are they going to do about that? And, how did they get it? And what did they do to the other person on stage? And what is that person there for? I mean, there's like kind of incredibly dumb things. And, and the form is just merciless. It will not work. At least if you're writing narrative, realist drama, if that isn't happening, the stupidest audience in the world will smell it in 2 seconds, and it just lies there.
I've always been amazed, that's because I've worked so much as a composer for other people's plays, where in a funny way, you're sort of on the director's side, or at least the director hires you.
Yeah.
I often think that there are writers who I wish could almost go beyond other people's productions and get to watch see that sometimes
See
the
how
writer
it's
is
put
wrong,
together,
or
yeah.
at least that the process by which a director and actors and designers try to put something together is its own strange mechanism. I think that's a hard thing for writers now.
Well, because we make it impossible. I mean, we don't have enough time in rehearsal ever. So, you give 3 weeks to a new play or 4 weeks to a new play, and it's just not enough time. The first week of a rehearsal is entirely about everybody being hysterical and terrified that they're all in the room together. And you can pretend that you're going to get stuff done, and there are maybe a few things you can get done, but it's basically a wash. And then you have a week where if you're the director and you've been hired by an artistic director at a nonprofit theater or whatever your relationship is to the producers, you start to feel like it's creeping up on you, and you know that you have about a week to kind of like sketch in blocking, even though the first week has been lost and everybody is in complete confusion about who they are, what they want, or what they're doing. You sort of put this, traffic pattern on them. Then you have another week to kind of repeat it. And then you have one last week, if you're lucky, to repeat that over and over again and decide, have you really screwed this up so badly that you have to reinvent the traffic pattern at certain points, or can you just kind of hold on until you get into previews? And, if you say, I want you to move on this line, and the whole scene or act or play is dependent on the character being enormously interested in being right here with the character, and you've moved them across on the line away from the person, you and the play have parted company here. And it's hideous for playwrights to watch that happening. On the other hand, the realities are you get those number of weeks, and finally, the person who wrote the score, the person who made the costumes, the director, the playwright, everybody else is gone, and it's just those people on stage pretending to be other people. And one thing that I think playwrights must come to an understanding of is, that freaky thing about great directing, which is both leading, and it's like politics. I mean, it's leading the actors to the right conclusions, or keeping them looking until they found a conclusion that really makes sense in relationship to the text, while at the same time giving them authorship, so that when they are up pretending that this is, at least in part, spontaneous event and utterance, they can really feel that. And that's hugely difficult. And all the best directors that I've worked with struggle enormously with that. Like, at what point do you lead, and at what point do you let go? And how do you make these people feel that, ownership of their souls, of the characters that are going to be their souls while they're on stage? Without that, you're going to have a dead event. And on the other hand, if they've decided that the character is, decompensating schizophrenic, and in point of fact, they aren't, you start to get into serious trouble.
Right.
And getting a sense of how that works in a rehearsal room and the delicacy of rehearsal rooms, it's a very weird thing that we do when we get together and create this new world out of especially it's the first time a play has been done. The first time we did both parts of Angels in America together, it was like getting hit by, 6 buses. I mean, we couldn't believe that anyone would ever be able to survive doing this thing. Now people do it in high school and stuff, and it doesn't seem all that hard because they know it has been done and can be done.
Right.
And that's the difference. It takes away that really enervating, gut-destroying doubt. Is this madness? Are we just going to fall off the edge?
Moving from being a director to being a playwright leads me to actually really wanting to ask, you fairly famously write longhand. And I wondered, A, is that still true?
Yes.
And is that true of screenplays
No.
as well? And how is that different?
I don't know. Maybe
You write with fountain pens.
I write with fountain pens.
You were going to show me something, and
Oh, well, I mean, you
put
asked
them
me,
in.
so I was going to show you my fountain pen.
Yeah.
I have hundreds of them, but I always carry like 6 with me. Partly because it's really hard to refill them, like on airplanes. So if you have a bunch that are filled,
I feel like my only experiences with fountain pens, I've just gotten ink all over myself. So
you get ink all over yourself. But I like that. It makes me feel more like a writer.
do people now give you fountain pens?
This fountain pen is actually my grandfather's.
Really?
Yes, people give me fountain
Kushner.
pens. Rebecca Miller gave me one of Arthur Miller's fountain pens.
Oh, see, that's why you need to do things like that. Then people will give you awesome gifts.
And yeah, an old man at the Signature just walked up and said, "I hear you write with fountain pens here," and he handed me like 6 really wonderful ones.
Why? Well, I'm actually really, I didn't know that you didn't write screenplays that way, but what is it about longhand that you like for playwriting, and why not
I think it's
for
a
screenwriting?
lot. Well, you know, when you write in Microsoft Word, it already looks like it's been published. So I think psychologically for me, there's a sense that I've already, in a way, put it out in the world. I want to be able to make mistakes. I had said earlier that directing is very, very hard. One thing, and in a way, it's as hard as writing. One of the things that makes it as hard as writing is that I get to make my mistakes in the privacy of my own room and throw them away, or not show them to anybody. A director has to do it in public. I mean, everybody's going to see that you made that idiotic choice to have the actor move on this line, or that you were going to, you know, that you did this or that or the other thing. But my handwriting is horrible. And when I'm working on a piece of 8.5 by 14 legal paper, I can scratch through it. I can make little side notes to the side. I like the record that I have of how hard it was to get certain things and how easily other things happen. I like the feeling of drawing. When I get with one thing that I love about, I use old fountain pens because they have very flexible nibs, and when you make a downstroke, the nib broadens and the line gets thick. You know, sometimes I can even tear through. Right, it goes right through the paper, and you know, and I have this manuscript, and it's mine, and nobody could read it if they wanted to, and it only exists when I finished writing the first draft of Perestroika, which was 700 pages long. And I drove back from this cabin that I was staying in on the Russian River, and I thought, okay, if the car goes over a cliff and it burns up, they'll never know what happened. I mean, you know, and it was great for a moment to have this unique thing. I loved that, and I like writing that way. And it's always what I've done, so it's always what I do. With screenplays, I don't write on legal paper, but I do keep very long notebooks, and I frequently, when I get to a scene that makes me a little nervous, I'll write it out in longhand in the notebook. Like there are 18 notebooks for the Lincoln screenplay. I think that maybe I do the screenplays in a computer because I'm expressing my lack of ownership of the words. Playwrights own the copyright, so the play is mine.
That leads me to actually really wanting to ask, having been with you in the room for 2 productions of Intelligent Homosexuals Guide and the revival of Angels, which are obviously very different plays, but also, as you said, one, it had been done before, and the other, it didn't. When, you know, Act 3 arrived, it was a surprise to all of us. How do you know when a play is done, and how much a play is a text and how much it is a production? Because with Angels, this was a play that by this point was 15 years old.
20
years old, geez. And yet there were some significant changes you were making to Millennium and even more to Perestroika. And then in the case of Intelligent Homosexuals Guide, you know, we did the 2 productions, and then you've done it since, I know, at Berkeley with some very significant changes.
Sometimes you know that it's done. It kind of feels like it's fallen into place, or you know the moment when it has, and you kind of have a sense, maybe. I have said all along, and I knew, there was one scene in Millennium Approaches in the first part of Angels that I couldn't get right. It's the Courthouse steps scene. It's Act 2, Scene 5. And Joe and Lewis are talking, and all the way up to the very first preview of the play, the first time it was in production, David S. Bjornson was directing it in San Francisco. The scene, you felt the audience kind of leaning forward. This was a scene that was going to tell them something, and then it didn't tell them that. And they really liked the play, but I knew something was off. And then I realized it's because Lewis talks a lot, and Joe finds it very hard to talk. And I thought, okay, I have to shut Lewis up and get Joe to say something. And so I rewrote the scene, and we put it in that night, right before the first preview, and we put it in during dress, I guess. And the minute it went in, the feeling of watching the play, I think, changed radically for the audience, and it completed the play. And it's call it a penny drop moment, where everything in the play, on every level, the psychological, the narrative, the philosophical, the theological, the thematic, the whole audience as one, something kind of all those elements chime together, and the audience knows that everyone in that room is having the same, on some deep level, having the same experience. When an audience laughs, it's a way of checking in on itself. If a line gets a huge laugh, I think that's why it's really important to have a great joke near the beginning of every play, because if the audience can hear itself sort of roar that approval early on, it knits into an artificial, organism. When one of those moments happens, it's not a laugh moment, it's just a moment where, in terms of, pheromones or galvanic skin response or something in the air of the theater shifts. And once you get that, it can happen at the beginning of the play or the middle or even near the end. Once it's there, the audience can go forward into the rest of the play with this exhilaration. Many plays don't have that, and they don't have to have it. And Perestroika still, I think, doesn't have it, and I'm still looking for it. Parts of the play are in sort of radical disequilibrium with each other. And it makes for a really fascinating kind of dynamic mess. And a lot of people have liked Perestroika more than Millennium, because in a way Millennium feels neater and Perestroika feels crazier. And that's part of why it does. But it also means that I can tinker with it and I think worry less about screwing it up. Millennium is just finished. Caroline, I knew at one point or other that it was finished. The adaptation of The Illusion that I did is done. It just feels like, I don't know what else I would do with this. But there are 4 versions of Angels in print. There are 3 versions of Homebody Cavil in print. And I kind of like that too, because it means that, when I'm going...
Well, and even within the things that are in print, I'm amazed how many times you leave in, you could also do it this way, or this actress liked this version, so I included it at the end.
Yeah.
Or you could,
sometimes I clean those up.
Bright Room is most amazing, where there's 2 complete, in the published version, there's 2 completely different plays.
And I gave people permission to rewrite it, which was a stupid, I'm never doing that again.
I wondered about, that feels like the most aggressive version where you've published something saying, because that transforms what the play is maybe about.
Yeah, it does. And I wrote, it was my first play, and I think it was in the middle of the Reagan, it was re-election, and, I couldn't believe, no one could believe, anybody with a brain and a heart and ethics, watching this monstrous group of people completely dismantling American democracy. Things that we thought were absolute certainties, Social Security and labor unions and the things that had transformed America over the course of the 20th century into a place that had a solid middle class and the ability to address things like the war on poverty. Things that programs that had been in place since the Depression were suddenly being called into question in the name of, this psychotic level of ego-anarchism and individualism and Ayn Randist nonsense. And it kept feeling like it was a nightmare that would, have to go away. And I think when I wrote the play, I thought, well, why am I writing a play? And we should all be out in the street, freaking out. And I didn't trust the play proper would do it, so I stuck this character in who kept coming out and sort of making the connection. And I guess in the spirit of that, and that her interruptions of the play itself, I thought, well, maybe people should continue to do that. A lot of the times when I've read what people have done, I'm kind of horrified. They don't
I was
really
interested,
get it.
You said the thing that maybe all of us wonder when you said sort of, why am I writing a play? Why am I not out there? And I think one of the things about Angels and about Normal Heart, where they were plays where it felt like, oh my gosh, someone's writing a play that is a play and also is actually seems to be activating something, or at least allowing some kind of activism to occur through the play. And I just wonder that question of, can you be an activist and a writer at the same time?
Yeah, those are the questions, I think. And, I think that theater can absolutely be used as agitprop, but I don't think it's its best use. I think that to know in advance where you're going and what the answers are is a way to create lifeless art. I've said to every playwriting class I've ever taught, if you are only telling the audience what you believe you know and you think they don't know but need to learn, you're going to bore them to death. You know, all theater is preaching to the converted in a sense, because I think when you write a play, you imagine an audience of people like you who know already everything you know, which puts you on your toes because you have to come up with something to say to them that keeps them engaged. And so what are you going to say to these 800 people in the dark who know all the things you know already? They know that it's bad to be nasty to gay people or black people or trans people or women. They know that already. So what do you have to tell them? I mean, how do you keep yourself interested in the world by saying, where are the things that you don't have an answer to? Should I be on the barricades or writing a play? Well, that's a good one. I mean, what happens if you're, living in the beginning, in the dawning of the era of Reagan, when you're told that selfishness is actually the greatest act of love you can perform, and isolation and individualism are the way that you take care of other people, and selfishness and greed and conspicuous consumption are the ways that you make the world better. If you're in the middle of all that and you're a man and suddenly you're in your late 20s, early 30s, and suddenly your lover becomes catastrophically ill, how do you reconcile what the world is telling you and what gender roles have told you, and even if you're a lefty, what your notion of progress has told you should be happening now, and what is actually happening biologically to this in the body of this person that you love, and what happens if you run? What happens if you refuse it? And what do you discover that way? And those questions, I didn't know the answer to them. I still don't know the answer to them. So those seem to be like good questions to ask. And the great preachers, I mean, John Donne didn't turn to and just say over and over again, God is great, God is good, let us thank him for our food. He asked prodigiously difficult questions, because doubt is the necessary concomitant to all faith. And doubt is what we go to church or temple or the mosque to address, the cloud of unknowing. What does all this mean? Why do people die horribly in a world governed by a just God, et cetera? And you can't answer that question, but that's where you start, and you all hold hands together and you walk out into the dark. On some deep level, the audience knows that we're all in the same boat and we're all heading in the same direction, and there's this thing that's being made that didn't exist before we, hundreds of people, and the people in the stage got together to make it, and we all own it, and let's see where it's going to take us. And that, I think, is, electrifying.